Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Vernick. I'm the Membership Engagement Manager at the Society of Hospital Medicine. I will be the staff support for today's webinar brought to you by the Disaster Management and, wow, that is a bad blank. The Disaster Management and Preparedness Special Interest Group. Thank you so much to all of you for taking the time out of your respective calendars and days to join us this afternoon or late morning, depending on where you are. Before I turn it over to Dr. Gabby Frank to introduce today's topic and speaker, I just want to give a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing in the future. It'll be in the HMX community, and we'll make sure that that is uploaded within the next few days. I also would like to ask that if you are not already muted, to make sure that you are muted so that there's a reduction in background noise. Please feel free to also use the chat box for any questions. We will answer those at the end of the didactic portion of the presentation. We also ask that you keep your camera off to minimize distractions, but you should find that you can turn your camera on and use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to ask a question at the end of the presentation. You can also use the chat box as mentioned. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Frank.
Well, thank you everybody for being here, and for those who are actually going to be watching these videos later on. It's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Jason Persoff. He is a hospitalist and a senior fellow for the Society of Hospital Medicine. He's also an internationally renowned storm chaser and an associate professor of medicine at the University of Colorado. He's fantastic. He's a very engaging speaker. You're going to love this talk. So I don't want to spend too much of your time, but thank you for being on this talk of everything, everywhere, all at once. Introduction to Disaster Response and Preparedness, as I said before, by Dr. Jason Persoff. He's awesome. So please enjoy.
I wish she hadn't set me up like that. Now I'm only going to be fraught with disappointment. But anyway, welcome everybody. We're going to talk about a sort of a disaster 101 today. And so as we go through the agenda, what we're going to ask and answer are, what is a disaster? Even though most of us know what that is, to really define it in terms of measurable, what is a disaster? We'll talk about the emergency preparedness cycle, expanding incidents, incident command system, and then further training. So I want to acknowledge first that I have a huge thanks to my SIG group, the SHM Hospital Medicine Disaster Preparedness and Management, that Kevin had trouble saying because it is a big mouthful. But in particular, I want to point out Kiara Mendel, who's helped lead our group in terms of the SHM connection, and Gabby, of course, who is the chair of our group and a wonderful friend as well as partner in crime. So I have no financial disclosures. If there's anybody who wants to sponsor disaster stuff with financial stuff, please feel free to send it my way. It's not usually where there's a lot of industry support. So we'll move through that. So fundamentally, it's good to understand what we mean when we talk about disasters. Disasters are referred to as hazards. The most common of these is the focal no-notice mass casualty event. Plane crashes, accidents, active shooter situations, and other acute events lead to an acute mass casualty event. And that leads to a rapid surge of patients, but usually over a short period of time that may only fundamentally interrupt operations for a few hours to a day. More recently, we've all experienced a widespread mass effect incident, which is what COVID was. And basically, a mass effect incident is something that lasts days to years and can include assaults by nature, hurricanes and tornadoes, or by man, such as bioterrorism and a dirty bomb. Pandemics and infrastructure failures, such as needing to evacuate a hospital, are mass effect events. And crippling cyber attacks are unfortunately on the rise as well against healthcare targets. Mass effect incidents are considered sustained and strained events. And by that leads to significant upheavals in the normal administrative structure and day-to-day operations. So when a medical hazard occurs, this can lead to a patient surge. And patient surge is defined as the capacity of a system to care for all its patients, and experience from multiple events suggests that most hospitals can tolerate, although it's not ideal, a mass casualty event that results in up to 20% of higher than normal volumes of acute patients in a short period of time. However, if this is a sustained mass effect incident or there are too many casualties, this will lead to supply-demand mismatch. Here, most organizations will rapidly develop issues involving the 4 S's of emergency response. So we talk about these 4 S's as staff, having insufficient staff to care for patients, supplies, insufficient amount of things on hand, such as ventilators, which are necessary for treating patients, space, in other words, locations where we can actually give good patient care. We learned in COVID, for example, that we could open up all the wards we wanted, but we may actually not have enough space to include all the equipment that goes with patient care. And then systems, broken systems such as normal referral patterns is a big issue and threaten the ability for the organization to function and take care of all of its patients. In its most extreme form, this can result in governors declaring crisis standards of care, a psychologically distressing situation where the best care that can be provided for the highest number of individuals trumps the usual standard of care and can result in allocation of resources to those most likely to benefit instead of necessarily all patients. A mass effect incident can also lead to the inability to usher patients through a system, such as we saw this in COVID, where we had high numbers of ongoing hospitalized patients, and we had an acute demand for more patients who needed hospitalization. Some states, including Colorado and New Mexico, invoked aspects of their standards, of their crisis standards of care plans to deal with the disaster. Regardless of whether a hazard is a no-notice or sustained event, all emergency preparedness focuses on an all-hazards approach. This approach means that organizations must be able to match unknown calamities with structured and effective responses. The process for developing effective plans is known as emergency preparedness, and it follows a cycle that is often driven, unfortunately, by painful experience, though that not need be the case. In an ideal state, preparedness develops on early warning indicators so that hospitals can begin planning for disaster. For example, an outbreak of Marburg that's currently occurring in Equatorial Guinea may prompt planning on the use of biocontainment procedures, training of personnel, and established protocols should somebody come in who would be a person of interest. Regardless of the cause, a hazard will inevitably arise at some point that results in the need for a disaster response. This is perhaps the most titillating portion of emergency preparedness, as it often dominates everyone's efforts and has a tangible effect on operations. One of the least properly prepared for or initiated phases comes in play near the end of an event, and that is demobilization. Demobilization, much like discharging patients, should occur on day 1 to understand what criteria or goals will be needed to enter the recovery phase of a disaster. As the immediacy of the disaster resolves, however, focus shifts to mitigation. Mitigation starts with a thorough after-action review, or AAR, that applauds what went well, but also takes an honest stock of things that need improving. This is where high-performing institutions place their emphasis and money, but many won't, since this phase is one where financial commitments and training are often needed to round out the response preparations for the next time a disaster occurs. That said, there becomes a decreasing interest or emphasis on the cycle as the times fade and the stress goes away. So we often see the biggest amount of emphasis in terms of both dollars and effort by an institution during the response phase, and eventually by preparedness, there isn't as much going on. During COVID, it was amazing to see organizations rise to the challenges of the situation, including investing time, money, and effort to resolve the disaster as effectively as possible. Demobilization is in progress for many institutions, but mitigation efforts for the next pandemic, restocking and improving staff, supplies, and systems may find the path forward hampered by the financial tolls COVID took on the organization. Nevertheless, effective leaders will help drive quality improvement forward, and hospitalists are really well positioned for that to occur. Just as in politics, all disasters are local. For example, a wildfire may lay claim to thousands of acres, but for any hospitals in the immediate threat area, the focus will be on that initial response. As the disaster progresses, many hospitals will likely use referral networks within their regions to start getting aid to transfer patients out of the path of destruction to other available beds within their own systems. But over time, local emergency management and public health may become involved to provide the municipality requests with additional aid. If additional aid is needed that cannot be dealt with at the county or city level, organizations may reach out to healthcare coalitions before ultimately reaching out to the governor for a disaster declaration. Pretend the Yellowstone volcano erupts and it affects multiple states throughout a large region. A federal approach is needed, which requires authorization from the president to allow FEMA to enact the National Incident Management System. That shows up that the higher you go in the chain, it's going to take more time and executive fortitude in order to go ahead and make things work. For clarity, the terms I've used here include a few acronyms, and these include OEM, public health, and EOC. There's a lot to take in, so just so you know, the Office of Emergency Management is usually run at the county level. Public health we know about, and emergency operations centers I'll talk about in a little bit. I realize that probably is more than you were looking for, but let me kind of break it down a little bit more. The most familiar, most practiced, and coordinated effort always occurs between first responders and hospitals in a local area. Again, generally most facilities will be able to respond to a disaster effectively when it is an acute no-notice event, such as a multi-vehicle accident, because that usually falls less than 20% of normal excessive volumes that we would expect to be able to absorb. Once a situation expands, however, such as, let's say, a passenger train crashes, local resources will likely be overwhelmed and will rapidly begin engaging their health systems for support, potentially transferring patients from the most affected hospital outward to other outlying partners. Let's focus a bit on the roles of OEM and public health in the immediate vicinity first, because those may not be as clear to most people. So most people aren't familiar with emergency preparedness, may not understand the role of the Office of the Emergency Management for their locality, be it a city or county. In short, these guys are the logistics experts. Think of the train crash. This image, taken from an outstanding explainer video, which is linked below, shows the mayor speaking to a bunch of different first responders who are all clamoring for help clearing the wreckage to get to survivors. Most fire departments don't have large equipment to hoist train segments or perform specialized search and rescue. The mayor can declare a disaster, and that small person on the right of the screen is the county's emergency manager. She's off to get that equipment ordered and delivered ASAP to help with operations. OEMs also provide financial and technical expertise ranging from incident management teams to field operations. They also are essential for obtaining large or specialized equipment. Need to get a scene lit? They can get powerful outdoor lights. Need a bus to transport the walking wounded to the ED, leaving EMS rigs for more seriously injured? That's OEM in a nutshell. They basically provide all the logistical support that are needed for expanding incidents. For hospitals, this can include snowplows during a blizzard or emergency generators during powerful storms. At least for this group, most of us are pretty knowledgeable about public health. Public health is responsible for augmenting the health, wellness, and treatment of individuals during a disaster. Their expertise ranges from providing consultation on possible persons under investigation for zoonotic diseases or returning travelers, like if somebody has Ebola, or in the case of a bioterror event, they are able to rapidly get and disseminate antibiotics, antidotes, or antivirals from pods that are guarded as part of the strategic national stockpile. Next, we'll focus on the broader response if this continues to expand, known as the healthcare coalition. In essence, healthcare coalitions are geographic cohorts of public and private agencies that respond to and prepare for disasters. They have many different contributors, including PSAPs, basically large dispatch centers, law enforcement, fire and rescue, hospitals, local businesses, NGOs, and charities such as the Red Cross. They also encompass guidance from the OEMs that we just talked about in public health. Unlike healthcare systems, the importance of an HCC is that it helps bring all the parties to the table to guide a response in disaster. In our state of Colorado, we are divided into 9 HCCs. We had a large fire here in Colorado just over a year ago called the Marshall Fire. It was a rapidly expanding urban firestorm that prompted large evacuations of people and nearly 3 hospitals in less than 4 hours. While large numbers of fire and rescue units responded on the area to find victims of the fires, the Colorado North Central HCC stood up to help with those efforts and within an hour provided much needed coordination over a broad geographic area from the various different partners. Large events such as the Marshall Fire often require an even more robust emergency response, and in that case, the governor declared a state disaster area, which frees up funds for response and recovery, including providing even more specialized resources such as disaster response teams with more training and experience at managing large events. A state emergency operations center, or EOC, can be stood up to bring about resources from other states or unaffected counties. Various EMACs, and for simplicity, that's basically state-to-state mutual aid contracts, are in place for large events, especially those that occur closer to state borders. As complexity increases, it also takes more time for those EOCs to get the equipment or personnel into the area. And this underscores why local responses are vital to disaster response. Understanding the role of HCCs is important because they can respond much quicker than the other agencies involved. Unfortunately, HCCs don't necessarily have any legal authority to compel responses or transfers, thus why the governor is so important for expanding incidents to bring legal heft to the table. Now, the cavalry, or the feds, gets activated only from the President of the United States via FEMA. The governor informs usually a regional FEMA director who works with POTUS to declare a national disaster, which brings the process of regional or national support through FEMA. When a disaster gets that large, like Hurricane Katrina sized, and involves more than one state, the National Response Framework is a series of escalations necessary for a federal response. Part of this is called the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. NIMS has 15 different support functions known as annexes, and they represent federal responses to disasters. For those in healthcare, the annex called ESF 8 relates to public and medical health services, but note that there are other annexes to address all hazards, as you can see, from search and rescue to transportation. The NRM and NIMS are overseen by the Director of the Health and Human Services, and in the ongoing letter salad, the NRM and NIMS are activated after requests by ASPR. None of this is particularly relevant, perhaps, to day-to-day operations. However, this slide communicates just how complicated things we get when we move from local to more regional support. So, as part of the federal response, there are catchment areas that involve multiple states known as FEMA regions. FEMA continues to refine how these regions get involved in the emergency preparedness cycle, ranging from sharing of information to training to disaster exercises. Increasing effort has been made to improve and expand on regional disaster health response systems, or we call them more clumsily the RDHRSs, to provide coordinated responses within a region. Intriguingly, most of the fascinating and most challenging areas of these systems is that states tend to be very insular in handling their disasters, something that may be to the state's detriment and is something that is still being worked at a national level. Nevertheless, there are FEMA regions that act as clearinghouses for both special pathogens and medical countermeasures, including biodefense. Here in Region 8, we are trying to create a regional EOC for disaster coordination. Again, that's an emergency operations center. And that is how we are trying to improve disaster preparedness countrywide, but particularly for our region. So that was a lot of organizations and a lot of layers. I hope you've managed to stay with me here. And at the midpoint, we're going to take a break just to get some general take-home messages. Even if you learn nothing else today, remember that no matter how an incident expands or contracts, all disasters require local management and effective emergency preparedness cycles. Hoping the cavalry will just mosey on in when things get rough is not realistic, since it takes a long time to expand incidents for additional resources. Effective leaders will know not only their own organization's capabilities, but also appreciate how it integrates into the local OEM, HCC, and public health departments. But let's say you've decided it's time to have your own disaster. Well, in order to perfect your response, we're going to really focus in on the most important part of emergency preparedness, the incident command system. So to kind of give you an idea of the incident command system, I think it's really important that we take a brief moment and appreciate this video, which really sums it up very well.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats
Don't let anybody tell you it's easy. Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether. Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
EDS.
This man.
So thank you, EDS, for that fantastic commercial that was shown during the Super Bowl many years ago. But there is some truth in this. ICS is like herding cats. It is an outcropping from a number of horrible fires in California in the 1960s and 1970s. Here's a newspaper from 1979 in San Diego showing the devastation that occurred when fires overtook more than 150,000 acres. These fires got out of control rapidly because agencies responding to the disaster were unable to coordinate. Part of this stemmed from different radio frequencies, but some of it came from too many resources being sent to some parts of the fire, but none to others. Additionally, there was no common language for the types of resources being used, so some departments used a sump truck, others a wildland pumper, while others even called them tankers. They were all the same resource, but there was confusion between the departments of which one each department was referring to. Without knowing what equipment was there, fire planners were unable to stop the disaster from spiraling out of control. This led to the creation of ICS. It was founded more or less in the 1970s in California, but we'll circle back to what the actual ICS structure is in a moment. National adoption of ICS was brisk in the first response community, but became very important due to the events of 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. This prompted structuring of the national response framework as part of a presidential directive. And specifically, ICS was recognized as the most important way to coordinate over every aspect of a disaster because it is so adaptable and effective. To show you why, I need to briefly throw a lot of words your way. You will inevitably blank out. You will also be unable to absorb most of what this means, but I promise it will be worth it. We'll dissect everything piecemeal, but, well, there's no holding it back. Let's just get right into it. The incident command system is the combination of facilities, equipment, personnel, procedures, and communications operating within a common organizational structure designed to aid in the management of resources during an incident response. But that's not all. It also has 8 components: a unified command structure, modular organization, manageable span of control, common terminology, integrated communications, consolidated action plan, comprehensive resource management, and pre-designed incident facilities. That's a lot to take in and far too much to be covered today. So what I'm going to do instead is focus on the most important aspects of this. So we're going to talk a lot about the top 3 components of the incident command system, and I'll give you a real-world example that literally happened last week. It's pretty wild, the timing of that. So I'm really excited. Here we go. I'll direct you to go to get training if you're really interested in these other issues at the end of the talk, but suffice to say, most people are not able to easily understand incident command at first glance. I'm going to make the argument that the top 3 components, however, demonstrate why ICS is so essential in managing disasters. I'll also note that ICS isn't just for disasters. It can be used successfully for any large-scale event that requires interagency coordination. Now, for example, Denver hosted some of the games in the Stanley Cup this past winter, or the previous one actually, which, for the record, the Colorado Avalanche took that cup. But that required standing up an EOC to coordinate police, fire rescue, city services, ambulances, and hospital response plans with involvement from our HCC. Nothing untoward occurred, fortunately, except the beat down that the Avalanche brought to the Tampa Bay Lightning, just saying, didn't require an ICS full rollout, but the organizational structures of ICS were intact and were able to respond should anything have happened. Now, medicine rarely has difficulty with common terminology, but communications, action plans, resource management, and pre-designed incident facilities are less familiar to most, but critical to the overall emergency preparedness cycle. Healthcare uses ICS, but it has its own ICS structure created also in California, interestingly enough, and it's called HICS. Using the same principles as ICS for other organizations, HICS uses a unified command structure. What that means is there is a predetermined but clear top-down hierarchy with very clear roles defined. We'll look at these roles next. But it's interesting that an interesting quirk that individuals who fill the roles in HICS may be responsible for, in their positions, being placed in positions of authority and responsibility that are very different than normal operations. We'll look at a case example, like I said, in a moment, that occurred last week. But here is the key component of HICS. The command and general staffs are different support systems for the incident commander. For all emergencies, an incident commander is placed in charge of the incident. Out in that field, that commander could be the first fire rescue arriving at a single car accident, and no other aspects of the ICS chart would be activated. But for hospitals and larger organizations, the incident commander will be in charge of the incident. Assisting the commander directly are core assistants known as the command staff. They include several different officers. There are the public information officer, safety officer, and liaison officer. The public information officer handles internal and external communications. The safety officer ensures everything from ensuring chemical spills are contained properly to police protection in the event of an active shooter. The liaison officer communicates with other response organizations to coordinate responses or to update HCCs. The bottom line is that ICS is scalable with clear rules of who does what. The important part of having these different roles is that it adds to accountability of what is expected for all the members, while remaining flexible enough for creative thinking to thrive. The command staff, which is the bottom rung of this particular chart, can often include technical experts. For example, during COVID, infectious disease experts fulfilled the role, this technical advising that was necessary for the incident commander. Commander is influenced and often directed by the chief executive to ensure compliance with capabilities of the institution or its legal responsibilities. The general staff, which represent the operations, planning, logistics, and finance sections, are part of the modular organization of ICS. In short, resources are organized by certain responsibilities. Unlike command staff, these positions may be activated only when needed. The most commonly activated section is the operations section. Let me get to that part of my slide. Well, these glitches are going to happen. You're just going to have to live with it. I apologize. So the most commonly activated section is the operations section because it is the tactical response arm of incident command. Planning works very closely with operations to help develop the objectives and overarching plan for responding. Planning is essentially the strategy maker of ICS, while operations determines how to carry out those strategies with tactics. Logistics involves getting, tracking, and mobilizing other resources. In hospital disasters, this often reflects the need to organize volunteers who begin to pour into the hospital when news breaks of a big disaster. The least utilized, but perhaps one of the most important sections, is the finance chief. When disasters occur, reimbursement from state or federal governments often requires accurate records of who did what and for how long, and any expenses that are incurred. So we really want to get all of those sections, if necessary, expanded early on in an incident. Again, I've just given you an incredible amount of information about ICS. The key here is everything revolves around the incident commander and their direction on how to manage an incident. Each section has its own role, but those roles do not overlap, and that allows for maximizing efficient strategy planning and tactics. So let's look at what happened last week at my hospital. At around noon, certain phones at our institution went down selectively. We had wireless Cisco phones that could communicate with other wireless Cisco phones. And the phones at the desktops at different nursing stations could communicate with other phones that were also desktop at other nursing stations. But there was no crossover. The Cisco phones could not talk to the desktop and vice versa. This actually affected several key parts of our institution, including our emergency department's biophone, and also emergency numbers that are used in our hospital to signify code blues or security issues. A code yellow was declared. Now, in most hospitals, this is going to be the term that is used overhead to indicate that a disaster is in progress, or a hazard, as I pointed out earlier. That led to this creation of an org chart, which states that the incident command an incident command is going to be taking place through the ICS structure, and an incident commander will be appointed. Now, due to pre-set up rules, our org chart states that the incident commander is actually the nurse administrator on call. That role was not the CNOs, the chief nursing officers, that particular day, but a different administrator. In an incident, however, the commander has the authority, and not the CNO or the COO, to completely guide what's going to happen. That's because the hierarchy of HICS makes the commander the person in charge. While that commander has responsibilities to fulfill obligations of the C-suite that require legal or ethical oversight, the preliminary response often is solely the purview of the incident commander. We'll circle back to what an incident objective is on another slide, but our IC, with a little prompting, created a SMART objective that the general staff would need to come up with an alternative communications plan within 10 minutes. To that end, the operations chief began organizing all the house managers and nursing supervisors into a huddle on Microsoft Teams channel to issue orders. Those orders also went to the COO and CMO to allow for broadcast rollout of the plan to all staff and to ensure its execution. Again, the person who was fulfilling the operations chief was a manager on call and may not have ranked as highly as the COO or the CMO in normal operations. This happens a lot with ICS. The planning chief began to refer to our downtime phone plan and work with operations to disseminate those plans. They then also began to figure out the highest priority phone issues for code blue and security issues, while also planning for if this outage was going to last a short period of time or a long period of time. The logistics chief ensured that other wireless devices, which had been pre-placed on all the floors, were turned on and working properly for all the charge nurses. They also contacted IT to determine what things they may need for infrastructure, including whether cell boosters were needed in the short term to boost personal cell phone signals throughout the hospital. But all of the chiefs reported back to the commander. The public information officer then drafted our internal and external communications, while our liaison officer helped inform our HCC, our Office of Emergency Management, and our EMS partners about the change in communications. So that's an example of a command center coming together rapidly and effectively to manage an incident using the unified command structure in its modular organization. Note that the roles in this particular example remained separate and focused on their tasks. Frequently, when problems arise, it is natural to attempt to work the problem like we do during normal business operations. Again, when a hazard arises, the focus invariably shifts to command structure as opposed to normal operations. This moves things away from what I call spitballing and debate, and it turns it all into forward motion. So instead of having discussions and various committees, things are now dictated from the incident commander down, with each of the different general staff fulfilling their roles. In other words, nothing becomes more important to the hospital in carrying out the incident commander's objectives, and debate is completely trumped. Now, that's what makes HICS a top-down structure, and it's entirely action-oriented, which for many of us who have to work through committees is often quite a relief because things actually begin to happen. But for it to be successful, it is essential that people who are going to fulfill those roles drill repeatedly to learn how to carry out those actions, and for leaders in the normal operational structure to become comfortable with ceding command to the HICS structure during emergencies. Our COO struggled with this a little bit during the command center activation, but eventually she was able to understand how the different operational roles were being fulfilled. The last major principle of HICS that I'm going to comment on is its versatility, known as a manageable span of control. In order to optimize what any one leader on the HICS chart is managing, it is important that they are not overseeing too many staff. HICS works best when any leader is managing 3 to 7 subordinates, with the ideal number being around 5. What do I mean by subordinates, and how does that relate to scalability? Well, when an incident expands, such as with a hospital evacuation for a hurricane, the number of moving parts can become overwhelming and thus must be broken into smaller, manageable parts to be successful. Before we expand, let's take a look at the simplest command structure. Let's say there is a major motor vehicle accident and 10 victims are en route to the hospital, half of them critically injured. This scenario is common at a large metropolitan hospital and would likely cause a short-term ER surge and would only generally affect the surgery, anesthesia, critical care, and emergency department services. Given that the scenario is common, it is likely that all affected staff are going to be managing the incident well, but the number of victims may be higher than would be expected. So an ED physician would likely serve as the incident commander to ensure that the ED absorbs those patients effectively and gets patients the critical, particularly the critical care patients, to the operating rooms as soon as possible. They are the incident commander. They no longer perform any patient care, but instead designate the charge nurse, for example, as the operations section chief, but also she would become, in this particular case, the scenario that I'm listing, or he would be responsible for the other portions of the incident command structure. Since the incident commander has an idea of the priorities of the situation, they would create smart objectives to facilitate the triage and distribution of patients. The operations chief would work out where in the ED the patients will go. That's a planning function. And then which nurses will be responsible for staffing those units. They will reinforce already established protocols for responding to the incident, which can include logistics. For example, having the appropriate services paged to the emergency department. The incident does not require the whole hospital to stand up a disaster response, so the command staff are consolidated into the charge nurse alone. The charge nurse may create individual branch directors that manage different zones in the ED so that they don't have to get into the weeds. The branch directors would ensure the staff under them are fulfilling their roles as each of the patients, as each of them arise. But let's say instead of a motor vehicle accident, we were talking about a train derailment with chlorine gas released near a neighborhood that's part of the major metropolitan area. That would warrant things to move far beyond just an ED response. Here's a rather expanded Hicks chart. Note that we still see the usual 4 sections from our prior slide: logistics, planning, finance, and operations. But due to the scope of the response, those chiefs need to supervise several subordinates who themselves will likely be supervising others. First, let's look at the logistics chief. Note that underneath the logistics section, the chief is supervising 6 subordinates that have very important functions. These include communications, transportation, material supplies, nutritional supplies, IT, and facilities. The facilities unit leader actually also supervises the damage assessment and control officer and the sanitation and systems control officer. It's critical that those unit leaders provide information up the chain of command to the logistics chief, who can guide each of them to fulfill the will of the incident commander. But the logistics chief does not supervise directly the facilities unit leader's subordinates, because that would be too many individuals to supervise. If all of them were under the logistics chief, that would result in 8 different subordinates. So a sub-branch was created and management was placed under the facility unit leader. A brief pause. You may have noticed I'm using terms like chief, officer, and unit leader. These are part of the standardized nomenclature of Hicks, which allows for seamless understanding of each person's role and rank. They are not important to explain here, but they are pivotal for the proper function of Hicks. Let's now look at the operations chief. You'll note that the chief's span of control is only 3 subordinates. In this case, that's lower than normal, but that's made up for by sheer complexity. The chief is managing a large section. Note that each director underneath him has multiple subordinates under them, and some have even further subordinates. The goal here again is to maintain a span of control. The decision to appoint additional leaders depends upon the incident, but conversely, the goal to collapse positions is the function of planning for demobilization. It looks very complex from the outside and is made a lot more complex if individuals do not stay focused on their specified roles. But when people rise to the challenges, the Hicks system is unparalleled for breaking a disaster into manageable chunks to be solved in rapid fashion. As disasters expand in complexity at the state and federal level, it is critical to get the overall response managed. Specialized teams with advanced training help establish emergency operations centers, and these centers coordinate multiple different commanders under one overall lead. For example, In the train with chlorine gas scenario, there would likely be an area command overseeing a fire and hazmat command, a county level EOC incident command, various hospitals, HICS, police command, etc. But as always, responses remain local, which is why it is so important to have a robust incident command system. I know that that probably all kind of went over your head, and unless you're, unless you're as good as this Marvel guy is, but not too surprising. The reality is that a fully flexed area command is exceptionally complex. The good news is that the whole area command is broken down into modular spans of control, which makes running the show much easier. So now we're going to go ahead and look at how we find the goals that we're going to use in incident command. And I think that's best shown by this video here.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Das hier ist
Thank you to the Berlitz for that fantastic thing. But the success of any incident depends upon understanding what the incident commander is thinking about. And for that, we need to take a complex problem and break it into its individual components that result in solvable objectives. The incident commander is responsible for creating those objectives, and they begin from the very first moments of a disaster. We advocate for the use of SMART objectives, and here they are. When we talk about an objective, it has to be very specific. In other words, we need to know exactly what it is that needs to be done. It needs to be measurable, so we would actually know whether or not the specific thing we're trying to do has actually happened. It needs to be achievable. So solving the world hunger crisis is not an achievable objective for an incident commander. It needs to be realistic. So there's a real probability that this will be able to be completed. And the T for timely is often listed as time limited. And so let's go back for just a minute and reflect on what we were talking about earlier with the disaster we had last week at my hospital. The operations and planning chiefs can establish effective strategies and tactics to address those objectives that we talked about. And this was the objective that the incident commander created last week. The need to establish alternative communications and plan for internal and external partners in the next 10 minutes. So breaking this down, it's important to note that the original incident command was very specific. It need to establish alternative communications plans, but it doesn't explain the how it is going to be accomplished. That is actually the responsibility of planning, who will come up with a plan, and then it will be executed by executed by operations. It was measurable in that there is an active communications plan for internal and external partners. It was achievable because we have a downtime plan that covers this exact eventuality. It was realistic for that same reason, and it was time limited in the next 10 minutes. Simple but not easy is a good way to think of incident objectives. Many incident commanders struggle with trying to solve everything themselves by knowing everything. But ICS says no one person needs to know everything. Its modular design allows individuals to focus on specific tasks to achieve those objectives. So the commander didn't need to know the downtime communication plan, nor did she need to know how to distribute that information. Each of those roles is fulfilled under ICS. It's not the most intuitive system at first blush, but it gets better with practice. And that brings me to this. The only way to really get good at incident command and understanding all of the vagaries that are there in any disaster situation is through further training. And so I offer several different suggestions for you, and these links will be provided with this webinar. The barrier for entry for disaster preparedness and understanding ICS, as well as all the different systems that I've listed today, is extraordinarily low. The Department of Homeland Security provides training for free. Now I'll show you how cool that is in just a moment. The first is they offer a number of online trainings, and the place where you're going to want to start is at this particular link. And basically that's ICS 100. The ICS 100 goes back over some of the things that I just talked about, but into a greater depth of how the incident command structure actually works. Then you'll want to move on to ICS 200, which talks a little bit more about how to do basic incident command, not just what the roles are. And then I recommend ICS 800, which explains the National Response Framework, which includes NIMS, which, as I pointed out, is how things gradually expand into a regional command over a situation. Now, where things are really cool is this one first, ICS 300. You can sign up through your state for in-person training. It lasts 2 days, and it often gets people together who normally would mix. So you'll train with like fire chiefs and police officers and things like this to learn about how to practically be an incident commander. It's a lot of fun. But since we want to really hone in on the healthcare, in Anniston, Alabama is the Center for Domestic Preparedness. And this particular course right here is the Healthcare Leadership for Mass Casualty Incidents. And not only are meals covered during this 5-day adventure, but travel to and from, as well as lodging, is all provided by the Center for Domestic Preparedness with no cost to you. The only cost is time, and that's on you. So I highly recommend people go through that kind of training, and I think it'll help you understand how incident command works, as well as how you as hospitalists can go out and actually become part of that command structure. Because I think hospitalists serve a very important role in all forms of disaster response. In summary, emergency preparedness is essential to addressing emergencies. Practice is critical. All disasters are local, so preparation is needed locally, as the cavalry may be a long way off. HICS operations can be expanded or contracted to respond to any incident, and in order for that to happen, the incident has to have SMART objectives that help individuals thrive. So this is really one of the see one, do one, teach one. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to open it up for questions. And if there are absolutely no questions, then either I've been talking directly to myself, which is possible, and actually would be relieving given the number of oopses I had. And so I am going to thank you all for being here. If you need anything, I'm going to put my name in the chat and my contact information so that you can reach out to me. I'm happy to help institutions help get hospitalists in there. In the command center, because I think it's really informative. And yes, as Kevin put in there, you can definitely raise your hand if you have a question. Otherwise, so is SIG planning a presentation for Converge next year? Yes, we are planning that. Actually, we're planning a tabletop exercise to give people an excellent opportunity to try and put some of these exact principles in action. Well, I love when people say that I'm going to give you back time in your day, like it was mine to begin with, but you have 11 more minutes than we had, and I want to thank you all for the time and attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Persoff. As a reminder, we will be sharing the recording of this webinar in the Hospital Medicine Disaster Management and Preparedness Special Interest Group on HMX, which I've linked in the chat. And we will also ensure that there is follow-up so that you can access this recording, and we encourage you all to stay connected through that community as well. Thank you so much for all of your time, everyone.